Okay, you're live.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. If you're watching this on YouTube now, if you're watching this in the future, whatever time of day it may be, we're incredibly honored to count on your view and participation in this really critical conversation today. And I'm very honored in my capacity as co-general coordinator of the Progressive International to be moderating this discussion at this very critical time. If you're tuning in now, my expectation is that you know that the US war, I don't think anything less than that word will suffice to describe it, on Cuba, its sovereignty, its democracy, its people, and its internationalist projects is now reaching a new fever pitch. And it's our collective obligation to understand the nature, the texture, the contents of that war in this phase of its escalation, and to think together about what can be done in defense of Cuba's sovereignty and of the incredible project that it has led for over 6 decades. I'm honored today to count on the participation of so many distinguished speakers and guests and viewers of this conversation. And first among those is a friend, an ally, and a tremendous voice for the Cuban people, Deputy Foreign Minister Carlos Fernandez de Cosillo. We will hear from him first with a brief history of U.S. sanctions before turning to other distinguished guests, such as UN Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measures, Alina Duan, as well as Professor Francisco Rodriguez, who joins us from the University of Denver, and of course, one of our most distinguished guests today, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who will lead a dialogue towards the end about what can be done to strengthen ties between Cuba and peoples across the world, as well as what must be done for those of us who call the United States our country of origin, to militate against these illegal, cruel, unjust, and ultimately unconstructive measures that have impeded the expression of Cuba's really glorious tradition of internationalist sympathies and in the case of its doctors, critical basic services to so many millions of people around the world for so many years straight. So with that, I will pass the microphone immediately to Vice-Canciller, to Deputy Foreign Minister Carlos de Cosillo, to give us a brief overview of where we've been in the long 6+ decades of the US effort to strangle, suffocate, and foment, in the words of a famous State Department cable, social upheaval on the island or the archipelago of Cuba, and to give us a sense, of course, of where we are now, where that long history has led us to now in Trump's return to the White House, and in the quick month in office so far, what that has meant in terms of US policy towards the island, what it has meant towards the renovation of the so-called Monroe Doctrine that has granted the United States a sense of domination over the Western Hemisphere, and of course, what are some of the existing efforts led by the Cuban people and their allies across the world to pursue alternative paths to the restoration of sovereignty, to the defense of its people's basic rights, to development, to health, to food, to energy, and the like. With that, I pass it to you, Deputy Foreign Minister Carlos de Cosillo, and I thank you all again for joining us for this really critical conversation, such an important time in the history of solidarity with the Cuban people.
Thank you, David. Hello to all of you again, and thank you for organizing this seminar and this webinar for what for Cuba is a highly important problem. To understand the history and the timeline of what the system of coercive measures have meant for Cuba, one needs to first of all place itself in the Cuban context of the 1950s and the Cuban economy and society of the 1950s. Cuba's economy depended basically on one industry, which was the production of sugar. That for its revenue, for its income, depended basically on one market, which was the United States. So there was a system by which there was a quota that could be reached of 4 million tons of Cuban sugar exported to the United States, and which was the main destination of Cuba's industry and the main source of income, almost practically the only one. The other part of this was that Cuba, for its society, would import practically everything from the United States: consumer goods, goods for infrastructure, for construction, for industry, for the life in general. It was an economy highly dependent on the United States. The United States also was owner of most of the productive land in Cuba, of many of the utilities, of most of the industry and the productive fabric of Cuba society. That was the reality that we faced. The revolutionary process in Cuba, among its goals, set itself to transform that reality, to reduce the dependency of Cuba of one industry and to reduce the dependency of Cuba of this market. And of course, to free Cuba from this overwhelming domination of its economy by a former power. This entailed the need to transform the structure of the economy, the structure of the creation and enjoyment of wealth, and inevitably the structure of property. Of course, all of this was able to call for the reaction and the wrath from the US government in general terms. From the very beginning, it set itself to do what was its history in Latin America, to either overthrow easily the government or to corrupt it and buy it. When this proved difficult or practically impossible by the beginning of 1960, 1 year after the victory of the Cuban Revolution, then there were two avenues. The CIA began plotting an invasion by mercenaries that were recruited among Cubans that were from the previous regime, which ended 1 year later in the Bay of Pigs. And at the same time, the State Department had to devise which was the way to try to overthrow this government. And there's a very educating document written in the 6th of April of 1960. This is 1 year after the revolution, by a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. His name is Lester Mallory. And in this memo, among other things, it said, the majority of Cubans support Castro. It also said, the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection, based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. It goes on later, explaining how to do this. And it says, in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. This has been, in real and in practical terms, the policy governing the attitude of the United States towards Cuba since the beginning of 1960. And it explains the whole structure of what we call the economic blockade, which are the coercive measures applied by the US against Cuba that equate to economic warfare. Today, one is surprised and one is alarmed when the US government says that it's going to raise tariffs 25% to an economy, some economies which are member of the G7. This is child's play compared to what happens with Cuba, and I'll try to describe it as succinct as possible. In the first half of 1960, when this memo was written, the US began by reducing the quota of sugar that could be exported to the United States. By June of that year, it was able to interrupt the supply of fuel. All fuel for Cuba came from the United States. So the oil companies of the time, the 7 big companies, that some of which had presence in Cuba, refused to sell fuel to Cuba. And then, but in the summer, in July of that year, they refused to refine oil that Cuba imported from the Soviet Union, which was the other country that was ready to supply fuel once the US refused to do it. And this, as you can imagine, reduction of the quota, the sugar quota, and failing to supply fuel, and trying to prohibit the US companies in Cuba to refine Soviet fuel, of course, already signified a major blow to the economy. By October of that year, the US, for the first time, prohibited exports from the US to Cuba that depended on a general license. In other words, any export had to be with specific licenses. In December, it reduced to 0 the sugar quota, meaning that the only industry existing in Cuba, and the only source of revenue, could not sell to its natural market, the US, any more sugar. It's cutting the possibility of Cuba of receiving financing. By February of 1961, it had the prohibition of exports from the US to Cuba under general license. By the way, on January of that year, 1961, the US broke diplomatic relations with Cuba. And then in February, it prohibited exports from the US to Cuba under general license. In March 31st of that year, it decided that it could not purchase sugar from any country that did not have diplomatic relations with the United States. It had already broken relations in January of that year. So it wasn't just that we did not have a quota that would benefit Cuba. It's simply that it was prohibited to sell Cuban sugar in the US market. In September of 61, all of this is in the same year, the US prohibited the assistance to the Cuban government and established what it called then a total trade embargo, even though it still wasn't a total trade embargo, as we've known later. It established then a blockade between Cuba and the US in the 3rd of February of 1962 by a presidential proclamation that based itself on a law of 1917 during World War I, which was Trading with the Enemy Act. World War I, and this was applied against Cuba. In February of 62, all imports by the US of merchandise produced in Cuba was prohibited. And in March of 62, all products totally or partially manufactured with Cuban products are prohibited from import to the US, even if manufactured in a third country. By August of 62, there was prohibition to lend assistance to any country that would lend assistance to Cuba. And in July of 1963, there was approval of the assets control regulations, which is the mechanism that governs all sanctions applied in Cuba. Now, so what does this mean by the end of 1963, and which is a reality today? That the US prohibits the export of Cuba of any product, any merchandise produced in the United States, with the exceptions of those that could be allowed through permissions, through licenses by Commerce Department and Treasury Department, which is very narrow, and today it's limited to agriculture and food products. Under very severe conditions, you cannot call that truly trading. But it also prohibits, it doesn't stop there, the export to Cuba of any product produced anywhere in the world by whoever, paying taxes anywhere, by whatever technology, if that product has 10% or more of US input, meaning raw materials, spare parts, technologies, software, trademark, anything relating to the United States. So one can think that in today's world, how many products anywhere in the world can one find that one can assure that does not have at least 10% of US technology? To give you an idea, Cuba cannot purchase or rent any commercial aircraft with the exception of specific aircraft produced in Russia. There's no other aircraft in the world that can assure you that it does not have 10% or more of US technology. But the issue doesn't stop there. The US prohibits the import into the United States of any merchandise, any product produced in Cuba. But also it prohibits the import into the United States of any product produced anywhere in the world if it has a minimum, regardless how small, of Cuban origin. So you cannot import into the United States steel that could have an ounce of Cuban nickel or Cuban cobalt. And Cuba is an exporter of nickel and cobalt. You cannot import into the United States machinery if it's built from steel that has nickel or cobalt originated in Cuba. And that, of course, in today's globalized world, makes it very difficult for Cuba to find a market where it can place its products, including nickel and cobalt. But it doesn't stop there. Americans are prohibited by its government to travel to Cuba. It is the only country in the world for which this prohibition exists for American citizens. And so Cubans, people from all over the world can travel to Cuba with the exception of Americans. Even though, as I will explain later, Europeans and people of over 40 countries are also threatened by the US government if they travel to Cuba. But again, it doesn't stop there. The US, in addition to that, prohibits all financial transactions with the US dollar or through any of the payment systems that exist around the world, which are overwhelmingly dominated by US systems. But it also prohibits transactions to Cuba or from Cuba that would transit the US banking system. And yet most of the transit that's produced in the world today goes one way or the other through the US banking system. So one can have an idea what all of this means simply by the measures put in place from the early 1960s. But at the beginning of the 90s, people in the US began to feel that that wasn't enough. It had failed to overthrow the government of a very small country with a very modest economy, with this overwhelming set of economic coercive measures without precedent in history. So they came up with the idea of a law, a Torricelli law of 1992, which to the rest added the prohibition of trade with Cuba by any subsidiary of a US company. But it also prohibited any ship from any country around the world to touch a US port if in the previous 180 days, 6 months, it had docked in a Cuban port. This is an additional burden for Cuba's commercial trade because not having access to the US market, much of Cuban trade is done at the other side of the Atlantic or at the other side of the Pacific. So one has a vessel come to Cuba with merchandise that most of the time has to go back empty because it cannot touch the largest market in the world, which is geographically just beside Cuba. Now, up to then, until the Torricelli law of 1992, all of the measures were executive actions by the president based on the law of 1917, meaning that any president of the United States, through executive action, could have changed that. That cannot occur with what was established in 92 by what is usually identified as the Torricelli law, because for the first time, there are two things, these two aspects, which were cast into law. Yet again, in 1996, the government thought that it wasn't enough. Socialism had collapsed in Europe, and they were wondering why hadn't it collapsed also in Cuba after all this economic warfare. So they came up with what's usually identified with Helms-Burton law. This law, among other things, codified it. First of all, I have to say that this is a very unusual and very comprehensive law. Very unusual because normally countries don't have that type of legislation against other countries. And I am sure there's no legislation similar to that in the United States against any country. Certainly did not exist against Japan during World War II or against Germany during World War II also. And I don't know of any other country with which the US has had a war that has such a comprehensive law. That, first of all, what it does is it codifies all of the coercive measures. The whole blockade that in the US is usually called embargo, it's codified, cast into law, with the aim of making it impossible for any future president to be able to change policy without an act or a decision by Congress, which is quite outrageous because it takes away the foreign policy mandate of the executive, of the president, to make sure that for the future, the thinking of the time could not be changed. And there was fear at the time that there were politicians, and that there were people in the United States, and that thought that perhaps a new approach should be found, that perhaps this is quite unfair against the whole population of this country for so many years, and that came to the conclusion that the design goal of defeating the government and changing reality in Cuba had not met. But the law goes further than that. It establishes in its chapter 2 a blueprint of what Cuba should be. In other words, Washington in the Capitol Hill defined what the nation of Cuba, an independent nation, member of the United Nations, should be in the future. And it goes to the point of saying that once the defeat of the government or the overthrow of the government occurs as a result of the aggression of the US government would designate an administrator that would manage properties, manage whatever happens in Cuba, the goals of the United States, including the elimination of unions, the elimination of the Cuban Communist Party, the elimination of any social organization in Cuba, establishing new ones, establishing a new system of property, establishing a new constitutional system and electoral system. And if and when the people of Cuba, through that electoral system designed by the United States, were to have a government, and if that government would follow the line of the United States, then and only then, it could be 3 years, 4 years, 10 years, only then would the economic blockade be lifted according to this law, which included among its demands that all properties nationalized for Cuba would be either returned or paid by the people of Cuba, like they did to Haiti for over 200 years that had to pay a debt for having liberated its country. And that is basically the scheme that exists today. During the Obama years, there were very, very few exceptions introduced because, as I said, the law prohibits it to very, very few exceptions because the law prohibits it. But the fact is that the blockade is so overwhelming that with these very few exceptions that were introduced through executive action by Obama in the last 2 years of government, you could see it. It was felt immediately because there was a slight improvement in the Cuban economy, and again, with very, very few exceptions. Cuba, as an additional measure, is in the US State Department list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism. Nobody in Washington can claim or can put any evidence that Cuba does sponsor terrorism. And I've spoken with many officials from the government, many members of Congress, and none has been able to tell me with a straight face that they believe that Cuba is a sponsor of terrorism. But the reason why we're there is because by law, the presence in that list of any country triggers automatically a set of coercive measures that is an additional burden over the economic blockade. And this we suffer today. In the past few days, since January 20th, the government of the United States has been adding new measures against Cuba, step by step, going after Cuba's medical services around the world. They will try to cut every source of financing for the Cuban economy, including in third countries. They're already threatening third countries, and we should not be surprised that they will continue to do so in the coming weeks, in the coming months, because the aim is to make the Cuban economy collapse. One usually listens here in the US the argument that the problems of Cuba are not foreign-made or foreign-provoked. They are the result of the failure of the Cuban system. If so, why does the US need to apply the most comprehensive system of economic coercive measures ever applied to any country to such a small country? Why doesn't it allow Cuba to fail on its own and needs to put this economic pressure on our economy? Finally, I just would like to say that this policy is rejected overwhelmingly and for many years in the UN. It is not Cuba that is isolated. It is US policy against Cuba that it is isolated. We have good relations with the rest of the world. And theoretically, we could trade with the rest of the world, with the problem that the US arm is so long and its impact is so great that it even damages Cuba's relation with the rest of the world. I'll stop here and thank you for your attention again.
Thank you so much, Deputy Foreign Minister Carlos de Cosillo. And in the name of time, I'm going to put one question back to you, which is a big question, but then we can move on to our other speakers. And the question, and I'm seeing this in the YouTube comments, I'm seeing this from our participants in the chat, is how is this possible? How is it possible on the international stage? Namely, we've seen UN resolutions, unprecedented UN resolutions that condemn this so-called embargo, or as we would call it, blockade, that garner near unanimous consent by the international community. How is it possible that the global consensus is not powerful enough against this US policy, longstanding US policy, codified, as you say, into law? And how is it possible domestically? What is your assessment of how it's possible that within the United States, such a policy, which, as we know from polls and surveys, does not reflect the democratic will of the US population, how is it possible, in your assessment, that this is sustained? And those questions, I think, are really helpful to feed into our later discussion about what is to be done to resist, oppose, and further dismantle such an illegal, cruel, unjust policy imposed externally to isolate, humiliate, and otherwise crush the democratic and revolutionary project underway in Cuba.
Internationally, I would say that it's possible because of the unfairness and undemocratic nature of the international order within we have been living for many decades already. If that were to change, then perhaps it would be impossible. But today, in the order that prevails and that governs international relations today, a superpower can get a way of doing something like this and threaten others for doing it. In the US, I think it's a combination of factors. The main one is that the majority of Americans do not know about this. This information is hidden for the majority of Americans. It is carried out in opacity, so that because one needs to think that as a matter of common sense, and I would say moral sense, the majority of Americans, if given the facts, will reject this. And we can prove it just by speaking with many Americans individuals who are surprised when one explains this, first, showing lack of information. And secondly, there's immediate empathy with what's happening in Cuba and with Cuba as a result of US policy. That's one major factor. The second one is the ability of a group of politicians and of people in the United States that have made a political career and have benefit from some of the corrupt practices that continue to exist in the US political system and allow them to pursue a very narrow policy of very narrow interest against and in spite of the will of the majority. I would say that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Foreign Minister. It's obviously, for us, now speaking on behalf of the Center for Sustainable Investment and the Progressive International, an honor to count on your words, your introduction, your orientation to this really urgent crisis of international diplomacy, of international order, and of course of basic democracy in the United States. On this issue, we're going to turn now to another distinguished guest, the UN Special Rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures, Alina Duhan, to speak more specifically about the humanitarian consequences of this blockade, about the impediments that implies for the delivery of basic goods, and therefore the infringement on the Cuban people's basic right to health, to housing, to food, and of course, to development. Over to you, UN Special Rapporteur, Alina Duhan.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for invitation to take part to this important webinar focusing on the impact and legality of unilateral sanctions against Cuba. My presentation will not focus specifically on the challenges faced by Cuba in the delivery of humanitarian assistance. At the same time, I will try to address the most important elements, impediments, and challenges in the sphere of delivery of humanitarian aid to the countries affected by unilateral sanctions. First of all, when we're talking about unilateral sanctions and their impact on targeted communities, we need to take into account that we're talking about the very comprehensive and very complex number of measures taken against specific countries. They are usually called economic sanctions, and it's insisted that, for example, targeted sanctions are not affecting population at all. In reality, it's not the case. First of all, it's necessary to say that we're talking about the whole scope of different types of primary sanctions, economic, financial, as well as many other types of them. We're talking about targeted sanctions, which are usually targeting higher state officials as well as businesses, which use to provide the revenue for the country as well as to provide working places to the employees. Altogether, that builds up a comprehensive network as soon as any sanctions imposed against higher state officials are considered to target the whole population, especially when we talk about sanctions imposed against presidents of countries. Every single individual on the territory of a country or having the nationality of this country is considered to be targeted in one way or another. It's also necessary to say that the impact of these primary sanctions might be exacerbated by qualification of states as sponsors of terrorism, as it takes place concerning Cuba. As a special rapporteur, I sent several communications to the United States of America insisting that qualification of states as sponsors of terrorism is fully against international law. It undermines fundamental principles of international law, including the principle of sovereign equality of states, principle of non-intervention to domestic affairs of states, and principle of settlement of international disputes by peaceful means. A recent redesignation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism is also fully against international law, and it's aimed to make sanctions pressure over the country even harder. It's also necessary to take into account that besides primary unilateral sanctions, a lot of measures are currently taken to enforce these measures and to create a feeling of fear around the whole world. I'm talking in particular about secondary sanctions, civil criminal penalties, as well as administrative measures against individuals which are announced to circumvent or assist in circumvention of sanctions regimes. Penalties might be really severe. Those designated as under secondary sanctions face serious challenges to delist, and those facing civil and criminal penalties might end up in 20 years of imprisonment or fines up to $1 million, and for business enterprises even much, much higher. All the above create the feeling of uncertainty around the whole world, starting from the UN agencies, which are often involved into delivery of humanitarian assistance, up to states, businesses, including those producing the vital goods, including medicine and food, as well as humanitarian organizations and donors. All of that impede the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Theoretically, when we are talking about sanctions regimes, sanctioning countries insist that they provide for the possibility of humanitarian exceptions. De facto, we have these humanitarian exceptions on paper only. In reality, they are neither effective nor efficient, and I will try to demonstrate a number of features which make them absolutely non-existent. In particular, unilateral sanctions regime usually provide for very narrow humanitarian exceptions which refer to food and medicine only. Traditionally, food and medicine are understood in the narrow understanding. They are not providing, for example, for the majority of medical equipment as spare parts to the medical equipment. They do not provide for vaccines for livestock, seeds or fertilizers, as well as spare parts, for example, for agricultural machinery, any electricity supply systems or water supply system, which make it impossible to provide a sustainable production of agricultural goods, providing food to the population, as well as to provide for proper maintenance of healthcare centers and prevention of diseases. As a special rapporteur, I have repeatedly called sanctioning states to make sure that no critical infrastructure, including healthcare, foods production and supply, as well as transportation, electricity, water supplies, and many other areas, are never affected by unilateral sanctions. My voice, unfortunately, has not been heard. I insist that imposing unilateral sanctions with providing very narrow humanitarian exceptions violate the principle of humanity, because it deprives people of the access to very basic needs and prevent them from covering the survival elements, including access to food, access to having food security, getting the highest attainable level of health, and quite often the right to life. Without access to proper water supply, it's not possible to ensure proper agriculture. Without seeds and fertilizers, as well as agricultural machinery, diesel for agricultural machinery, equipment for proceeding and storing, as well as delivering food to the customers, it's not possible to ensure food security. My report presented to the Human Rights Council 2 years ago about the impact of unilateral sanctions on the right to health clearly demonstrated the devastating impact of unilateral coercive measures, means of the enforcement and overcompliance, on human lives, as well as conditions necessary to ensure human lives. It's also necessary to take into account that even goods, and in particular food and medicine, which are eligible for humanitarian exceptions, cannot be delivered to the countries. For delivery of these goods, it's necessary to get a license, and the process of getting licenses, not even one, quite often it's multiple licenses, it's very long and quite often extremely expensive. I have been reported about cases when the humanitarian organizations managed to fundraise around $20,000–$25,000 to deliver humanitarian assistance to the countries under sanctions. It has appeared, however, that they need to pay the same amount in order to get license for the delivery, and as a result, they didn't have money for this delivery at all. Moreover, for getting license, it's necessary to get a necessary legal assistance or necessary advice about the processes how to get the license, because the process is usually quite complicated and long and bureaucratic. And many, especially smaller humanitarian organizations, do not have any possibility to do it. It's also necessary to take into account that humanitarian exceptions of many unilateral sanctions regimes provide for the possibility to get licenses only for huge humanitarian organizations or organizations which have been included in the UN or European Union, for example, humanitarian organizations list. For many other humanitarian organizations which are traditionally involved into humanitarian deliveries, the possibility to get license is much lower. It's also necessary and as a result, the possibility to get licenses and possibility to do the delivery is pretty limited. Unfortunately, I have to mention some other impediments in the delivery of humanitarian assistance, which are created by the use of unilateral sanctions, means of the enforcement and overcompliance. Unilateral sanctions do not include sanctions against specific goods only. Quite often, they include prohibition of any financial transactions. They might include a prohibition to get money from the country under sanctions or from any entity from the country under sanctions. They might include sanctions against transportation, insurance, and delivery. And as a result, it has been reported by many pharmaceutical companies that they refuse to deliver to sell goods, including medicine and other pharmaceutical and medical goods, because they cannot be paid. There is no possibility to deliver goods to the country under sanctions, and there is no possibility to insure these goods. And as a result, these companies quite often refuse to sell goods to the targeted societies, despite the fact that we are talking about food and medicine only, that are formally exempted from humanitarian exceptions. When talking to the sanctioning countries, they are usually referring to the fact that it was a purely business decision of the pharmaceutical company or a company which produces food. But in reality, it's not the case. There is no factual possibility for a company to get payment for the goods it's producing, and moreover, the company is usually very scared to be punished for selling goods, including medical goods and food, to the targeted society. And as I have already mentioned, the civil suits as well as criminal charges might be extremely high. Quite often, companies are also threatened to lose the US and European markets in the case if they continue to sell, including humanitarian goods, to the countries affected by unilateral sanctions. It's also necessary to mention that unilateral sanctions, means of the enforcement and overcompliance, prevent delivery of humanitarian assistance not in the case of unilateral sanctions only, but also when it comes to the implementation of resolutions of the UN Security Council. In 2021 and 2022, the UN Security Council has adopted resolutions 2615 and 2664. The latest one, 2664, provides for the unfreezing assets frozen under the decisions of the UN Security Council to enable the delivery of humanitarian assistance to the country. In reality, situation keeps to be extremely challenging. I have to admit that all main sanctioning countries like the US, UK, and the European Union have immediately adopted general licenses providing for the possibility to unfreeze assets authorized by the UN Security Council. At the same time, it doesn't settle the problem. Despite the fact that assets are unfrozen, it's not possible still to do the transfer. It's not possible to procure goods for delivery to the country under sanctions. It's not possible to insure. It's not possible to deliver. As a result, the same reasons which prevent proper delivery of humanitarian assistance to the targeted societies prevent proper implementation of resolutions of the humanitarian resolutions of the UN Security Council that constitutes a clear violation of Articles 24 and 25 of the Charter of the United Nations. It's also necessary to mention that the unilateral sanctions, means of the enforcement and overcompliance, exacerbate humanitarian situation in the targeted societies. Multiple reports clearly demonstrate that unilateral sanctions, means of the enforcement and overcompliance, usually end up in the growing rates of poverty, growing rates of food and health insecurity. And as a result, they are also affecting economic, labor, and social rights. As a result, people become more vulnerable in the face of economic challenges, and they need more humanitarian assistance than before. However, the delivery of humanitarian assistance becomes much more complicated. Unilateral sanctions are also affecting the functioning of humanitarian organizations as such. As I have already mentioned, humanitarian organizations shall be recognized by the United Nations or the European Union to make the process of getting licenses easier than before. For many others, it's very complicated. At the same time, a number of other challenges are faced by this actor. I would like to cite in particular that multiple humanitarian exceptions documents as well as guidances of sanctioning countries for humanitarian deliveries clearly put the burden of proof of purely humanitarian character of humanitarian deliveries on humanitarian actors. That basically means that organizations which do their best to deliver humanitarian assistance to targeted societies might get punished for the humanitarian work they are doing. Additionally, due to all the challenges, uncertainty, and the feeling of fear existing around the world in the face of unilateral sanctions, makes much fundraising for humanitarian deliveries to targeted societies much more complicated, because the donors are also extremely scared. Recent requests to monitor the whole delivery scheme as well as all supply chains might the dollars to be reluctant to provide finances for deliveries to the countries under unilateral sanctions. Quite often, humanitarian organizations might receive financial resources for delivery to the countries under unilateral sanctions under the conditions to monitor who are the beneficiaries which receive their humanitarian assistance, including that people supporting the government under unilateral sanctions shall not get this humanitarian assistance. All the above clearly violates the UN principles on delivery of humanitarian assistance like neutrality, impartiality, and non-discrimination. Humanitarian organizations report about operational and contextual as well as administrative challenges in doing their humanitarian assistance. Quite often it's very problematic even to get information about the licenses process as well as sanctions existing against specific countries. The challenges which I have been mentioned, it's not the exhaustive list. These are the main challenges faced in the process of delivery of humanitarian organizations. I would like to address now a few elements from the perspective of international law. Due to multiple reports by countries under sanctions, humanitarian actors, as well as people suffering due to the absence of the humanitarian assistance from abroad, I included paragraphs on humanitarian assistance and humanitarian deliveries to the guiding principles on sanctions, business, and human rights I have developed with active participation of humanitarian actors. The same issues are addressed in the commentary to the guiding principles, where I try to demonstrate the existing treaty and customary legal norms which provide for the legal regulations and provides for guarantees for those in need to get access to basic goods at least. First of all, I insisted that humanitarian organizations shall face protection when they genuinely exercise and do their humanitarian work. They shall not be subjected for the humanitarian assistance they are provided in the targeted societies, and such assistance shall be provided without any discrimination to all those in need. Additionally, it's necessary to mention that the humanitarian sanctions shall never be imposed against any types of critical infrastructure, including not only food and medicine, but also electricity, transportation, production of agricultural goods, water supply, gas supply, and many other. Otherwise, people in need will be deprived of very, very basic needs of subsistence, and they will not be able to satisfy their feed their basic needs. I would also like to remind about the existence of the principle of due diligence. From one side, all states, including those who impose sanctions or those who implement sanctions, they are under obligation to make sure that any activity, including the activity of private businesses under their jurisdiction and control, do not violate human rights, including extraterritorially. Businesses are also under obligation to make sure that their activity doesn't violate human rights. And it has been repeatedly maintained by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in its general comments, in the case if business activity on the territory of states or extraterritorially violates human rights, it will be both states and businesses and as well as states responsible for such violations. If people die due to the fact that pharmaceutical companies do not sell medicine, then the state hosting this building will be mutually responsible for the deaths of these people. Shifting responsibility and referring to the freedom of business to decide about the markets they sell life-saving goods, and it especially refers to monopolist businesses in the sphere of medicine and human rights, shall never be affected. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish a good success to your webinar.
Thank you so much to the special rapporteur on coercive unilateral measures. I think it's impossible to summarize the extensive record of abuses implied by these U.S. measures in their consequences, humanitarian consequences for the people of Cuba. But we'll attempt to expand now from that analysis with another distinguished guest. I'm incredibly honored and delighted to introduce a man who needs very little introduction for an incredible record, not just in Latin American, but also really hemispheric affairs to help us make sense of the long-term acute consequences of the US blockade, sanctions, and SSOT designation today. So I'll pass it now, the microphone, to Professor Francisco Rodriguez. Professor Francisco Rodriguez is now, after many other distinguished posts that he has held in his long career, Rice Family Professor of the Practice of International and Public Affairs at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. We're very honored to have you with us today. And thinking about the UN Special Rapporteur's presentation and how we can understand the more macro scale consequences, not just for the people of Cuba, not just for the economy of Cuba, but perhaps also thinking at this hemispheric and global scale. What are the consequences, rippling consequences of these coercive unilateral measures in their totality? And then also, where do you think we are now in the long trajectory that was traced out by the Deputy Foreign Minister, Carlos Fernandez de Cosillo, in the initial presentation in terms of this war on Cuba and on the Cuban people?
Good morning. Thank you very much, David, and thank you to the organizers for this opportunity to participate in this very important conversation about the impact that sanctions have had on the Cuban economy and what are the lessons that we can draw from this experience. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a few slides that I would like to share with you. Okay, here it is. So the first thing that I would like to start by describing is in terms of giving a broad framework for how we go about thinking about the effect of Cuba sanctions. And there are a number of countries, a growing number of countries in the world that have been subject to sanctions over the course of the past decades. And of course, Cuba's experience is one of the longest lived ones, particularly subject to US sanctions. Whenever we enter into discussions about the effects of sanctions, we reach a set of complex empirical problems, which have to do with trying to infer effects from a single country's experience. And as I will argue, there are a number of methodological difficulties because there's a lot of things that are going on in any country at any given moment of time. So disentangling the effect of sanctions from all of those other impacts which may occur on the economy is something that's quite complex. And economies are sometimes hit by adverse shocks, which are also external. So sanctions are, by and large, generally an external shock, although they do occur in response to political developments inside of the country. So they're not what we economists would call a completely exogenous variable, but they're definitely something that is generally decided outside of the country. But at the same time, there's also policy reactions which occur inside the economy that's sanctioned, and those also complicate what we term empirical identification of the effect of sanctions. And they may occur in two directions. I mean, you might have economic or social policies which are kind of not conducive to social progress, so that the negative impact of sanctions is difficult to identify from the negative impact of those policies. Or you may sometimes have the opposite effect, which is that you might have policies that are implemented to counteract the effect of sanctions. And therefore, if those policies are effective, you may not see what appears to be that large of an effect of sanctions, whereas really the effect is large. It's just that policies did a lot to deal with it. Now, there is one striking fact, as Ambassador Fernandez explained very comprehensively. Cuba has been subject to US sanctions since at least 1960, and we've seen changes to generally an increase in scope and intensity of those sanctions, as well as their consolidation into law, which means that they become essentially, from a political and legislative standpoint, not completely irreversible, but very hard to reverse. So we've been seeing that dynamic since 1960, but and also one of the things that happens many times with sanctioned economies, and I believe it's also the case for Cuba, is that there's a distinction between short-term effects and longer-term effects, and sometimes the adaptation capacity of sanctioned economies really takes effect in the longer term, so that the short-term effects can be significant, but then economies find ways to live with the sanctions, to adapt to the sanctions, to search for other trading partners. But of course, there are also shocks to those possibilities. But one place where I think that it makes sense to start to look, and it's perhaps the most remarkable factor about Cuba's gross aggregate numbers, is the strong difference between its performance in terms of economic growth and its performance in terms of non-income or non-growth human development. Now, this is something that's been remarked on during the time that I was at the Human Development Report Office, where I headed the research team of the Human Development Report Office. This was something that we always found very striking, and it's because if you take the Cuban indicators that go into the Human Development Index, and for those who might not be familiar, the Human Development Index is a composite measure that includes measures of living standards as measured by GNI per capita, as well as measures of education and health. And if we look at the components of this index, we find a striking characteristic, which is that Cuba is a country that does much better than the rest of the world in terms of health and education, particularly in health, but also in education. But it does much worse than the rest of the world in terms of income, in terms of gross national income per capita. And in fact, this is also even a significant challenge because in terms of economists' work on this issue, because since Cuba is not a member of the World Bank, it doesn't participate in the International Comparisons Program, which is used to generate purchasing power parity adjusted GDP numbers. So this is a significant obstacle to valuation. And in fact, in my tenure as head of research of the Human Development Report Office, I traveled to Cuba to try to address this issue with existing statistics so that we could maintain Cuba in the Human Development Index, despite the fact that it's not being a World Bank member makes the production of this statistics, it limits the production of this data in a way that's comparable to that of other World Bank members. But those difficulties can be overcome in terms of valuation. And what we find is that Cuba has a gross national income per capita, which is relatively low compared to the world average. It's really it's less than 50% of the world average, but it has a life expectancy which is 6.2 years higher than the world average and very much like that of developed countries. And it also has schooling levels, and the UN uses two measures. One of them is mean years of schooling, which is the schooling that the population alive at the present moment of time has. And the other one is expected years of schooling, which is the schooling that the population that is in school will develop over time, given current schooling rates. And both of them, there's a significant difference of 1.5 years or more in terms of kind of higher levels of schooling of Cuba relative to the world average. So that in terms of life expectancy, Cuba ranks number 46 out of 200 countries, which essentially puts it well in the level of many developed countries. In terms of expected years of schooling, it ranks 77th, which again puts it not at the level of developed countries, but it puts it significantly above most developing and less developed economies. But in terms of income per capita, it ranks 125, which puts it in the lower half of countries in the world. So there are different ways to read this data, but as one first striking indication, I think that what it tends to show is that this country's ability to generate income per capita is constrained in the sense that we see that its policies are able to generate higher increases in health and in education than they're able to generate increases in income per capita. So this is one indication that you may be seeing these constraints on its ability to interact with the rest of the world operate. Now, when we look at the time series data of Cuban GDP, the picture that we get is a bit more confusing or a bit less straightforward. And I'll explain how to interpret this in a minute, because I think that these graphs have to be read with a lot of care. But the one thing that I would point out is that if we trace some of the events that Ambassador Fernandez spoke about in terms of the early 60s formalization of the blockade against Cuba, if we think about the lifting of travel restrictions in 1977 and some other measures that are taken at the level of the U.S., it's hard to identify strong direct effects at the level of GDP per capita. Now, some of them we may be able to discern, but some of them are quite a lot more difficult. But this is also partly a reflection of the fact that there are a lot of things going on that affect the country's per capita income. So definitely you do see some effects like the USSR dissolution, which do have a significant impact on GDP per capita. And you do see that there are other measures in terms of sanctions that don't seem to correlate that well. But again, you have to read some of this carefully, and you have to read it carefully because one also has to think about what are the channels of causation through which sanctions interact. So one of the issues that determine the effect of sanctions have to do with restraining economic interactions with the rest of the world and restraining the country's insertion into the global economy. So maybe a place where it makes more sense to look at is imports. Now, we have comparable data since 1970 on imports. It doesn't go far back to 1960s in ways that are comparable. And here, we do start seeing some indications that there are some effects which do appear in the data, although again, it needs a complex and nuanced reading. So for example, we do see that there's when we look at the latter time period, we can look at the reimposition of travel and remittance restrictions at the beginning of the Trump administration. Of course, the COVID pandemic hits after that. And of course, there's a decline in imports and in trade that comes after the COVID pandemic. But what's interesting is that when you start looking at this in comparison with other countries, you don't see a post-COVID recovery, which you do see in most other countries. So this suggests that these restrictions that took place at around 2017 may have had an effect on the COVID recovery. In the same way, you can look at, for example, 2009, when the U.S. lifted the travel and remittance restrictions. You might say there's a decline in 2009, but this is the global financial crisis. Really, what happens is that after the global financial crisis, we actually see a recovery, which is also much more rapid than that seen by other countries. Still, there are other things that are obviously very important going on here, and definitely the dissolution of the USSR appears to have had a significant effect. But here again, there's one potential, I want to stress it's just one potential interpretation of the data where we could say, well, the Helms-Burton and Torricelli Acts actually attenuated this recovery, which would appear to have occurred, or to have been about to occur in the absence of those restrictions. But as you already probably have glimpsed from this, reading time series data and inferring effects of sanctions is actually something that's quite difficult to do, because we have a lot of other things going on. And because when we're looking at the effect of sanctions, we're looking for a partial effect. We're not looking for a total effect. That is, nobody is trying to, and nobody should try to argue that the only cause of changes in Cuban economic growth or in Cuban imports are changes in U.S. sanctions policy. So what we have to do is disentangle these effects from others, and that's difficult to do using econometric data. And in fact, there's only one econometric study that I'm familiar with that has dealt with this issue, which is the work of Pablo Vidal Alejandro, that's used econometric analysis. But there are a number of other case study and policy analysis, both qualitative research and desk research and macro data analysis. And here's a list of the 13 studies that that I've identified that have attempted to not just to describe the Cuban crisis, but have attempted to make an argument about the causal effect of sanctions. And they're generally, in fact, the 13 studies argue that sanctions have a negative effect, although they're not always, they also point to other effects, and as well as they point to differential effects in the Cuban economy. But now I want to take a step back, because what I've been doing in the first part of my presentation is what many people tend to do, which is to say, let's look at the effect of sanctions on this country by looking at the effect of sanctions on this country. Now, that appears to be a tautology. It makes sense. How else would you do it? Well, the idea of using country case studies as the key evidence to analyze the effect of sanctions has a limit, which is the inherent nature of the evidence. And let me play with an analogy here. So let's suppose that a patient comes into a doctor's office, and this patient has symptoms that their lungs are relatively compromised, and it turns out that this patient is a heavy smoker, and the doctor does the necessary diagnosis and does in fact find that this patient has lung cancer. How would we go about trying to establish the effect of the patient's smoking behavior on their cancer? Well, we could decide that we're going to look in detail at the patient's story. Or we could decide that we're going to do a graph of the patient's health conditions and try to see how that correlates with smoking events, with the moment at which they started smoking, with moments at which maybe they stopped smoking for some period of time, or others, with periods in which smoking restrictions were imposed and maybe they were not able to smoke in restaurants anymore. And we might find a very confusing graph. But that would not lead the medical practitioner to say, oh, smoking is irrelevant to this patient's contracting cancer, because we do have a significant body of evidence that tells us that smoking is a cause of cancer. It doesn't necessarily mean that for any particular patient, we can say that cancer was caused by smoking, because we also know that there are other factors. It may have been factors that have to do, for example, with exposure to chemical hazards in the workplace. So while we can never necessarily, and this is also analogous to the way in which we think sometimes, say, about climate-induced natural disasters, we can't pinpoint that a particular natural disaster is attributable to climate change, but we can pinpoint that the probability, the incidence of natural disasters is related to climate change. And here, I want to go back again and look then at what's the equivalent of the smoking cancer causes cancer evidence that we have. And I recently published a paper about a year and a half ago, where I surveyed all the existing quantitative studies of the effects of sanctions on living conditions. This is in the Journal of Economic Studies. And these studies cover impacts on variables ranging from economic growth, poverty, and inequality to health and human rights. And what do we find? First of all, 30 of the 31 quantitative studies, and I center just on quantitative estimates, econometric or calibration effects, find adverse significant effects of sanctions on living conditions. One study found ambiguous effects, which means that it found negative effects on some and positive effects on others. But this, by and large, and those who are familiar with the economics literature on the study of policy impacts will recognize that this is actually a remarkable rate of consensus. It's actually rare to find this level of consensus in the empirical literature. The other thing to point out is that the effects are quantitatively very large. I mean, for example, sanctions have been estimated to lead to a decline in per capita GDP of around 26%. So this is the equivalent of the magnitude of the US Great Depression. So sanctions caused a Great Depression in the countries that they're imposed on. A decline in life expectancy of around 1.3 years. This is the equivalent of the global effects of the COVID pandemic on life expectancy. In other words, again, very significant effect. And there's work which is forthcoming, and we hope we will definitely be circulating it very soon, probably in coming days. Joint work with Sylvia Rendon and Mark Weisbrot, where we estimate what the global death toll associated with sanctions is, and we find that it is of a similar order of magnitude to that of armed conflict. So in other words, we estimate that sanctions cost as many lives as wars currently in the world. So I want to close, given limitations in time, in showing you first a couple of graphs that show that despite these effects, the incidence in the use of sanctions has grown markedly over the course of the past decades. So what you see in the left panel there are the number of countries that are subject to trade sanctions by either the UN, EU, or the US. On the right panel, you find the share of world GDP that is subject to them. In both of those, we're now talking about a third of the world economy, or about a third of countries also that are subject to sanctions. So this means that they're a feature of our world, and they're a feature that is significantly impeding countries from carrying out their normal operations. And it's actually quite interesting that this has coincided with a decline in the share of GDP, of world GDP of the EU and the US, which are some of the countries that are imposing most sanctions. And part of this has to do with the fact that while these countries are a declining share of GDP, they are still a very high share, and in reality they have what I would label a duopoly power over the issuance of international means of payment. So it's not so much by restricting trade, but by restricting access to the dollar and the euro, which are the currencies that most international trade occurs in. So I want to close with a couple of comments about what this tells us and what we can learn from this experience. Something that happened and that Ambassador Fernandez chronicled with extensive detail is that there's a moment in which US sanctions morphed into legislation. And the moment in which they morph into legislation, because legislation is very hard to change in the US, they become almost for all effect irreversible. There's also very interesting academic work here, which shows that it's really not about public opinion in the US. And as Ambassador Fernandez also spoke about, most public opinion studies don't really find strong support for these types of policies, but they have to do much more with the nature of particular constituencies. There's work that shows that the percentage of diaspora voters in swing states in the US, swing states like Florida, is a key determinant of the US decision to impose sanctions. Therefore, it's not surprising. In fact, you might have heard that yesterday there was a decision by President Trump to revoke licenses for oil companies to operate in Venezuela, and that appears to have been out of a negotiation with the Florida congressional delegation, which called for the removal of these licenses so as to give their support to the passage of the reconciliation bill, which is necessary essentially to avert a debt crisis in the U.S. So so the fact is that, and the last point that I want to make is that what we're seeing here is sometimes very local political dynamics take place in sanctioning countries, which can determine kind of the future of sanctioned countries. And this is another rationale on top of those elaborated on by Special Rapporteur Lujan for why there's a strong argument to restricting the imposition of sanctions and of restrictive trade measures to the UN Security Council framework. And the forthcoming work that I cited with my co-authors Sylvia Rendon and Mark Weisbrod, we also look at this and we find that the global death toll associated with sanctions is much higher for unilateral sanctions. So that even though I agree there are also reasons to be critical of UN sanctions, it does appear that the governance framework associated with the imposition of UN sanctions does tend to limit their harmful effect on target economies. So with that, I close my exposition, and I'd be very happy to devote some time to questions.
Thank you so much, Professor. This is an incredibly generous overview of the econometric literature, but also a general sense, I think terrifying sense, that such a small group of interested parties can have such an overwhelming influence. In the name of time, I thought I would put one question back to you, and it's really about this question of unilateral sanctions, and I think is relevant before we pass the floor to Professor Alfred de Zayas, who's going to give us another sense of this. I thought we could put you two kind of into conversation, which is, you spoke about the economic side of this, but I wanted to sort of get your thoughts as someone with a rich set of experiences working in hemispheric multilateralism and Latin American multilateralism, which is, what is the risk that the explosion of sanctions as a mechanism of economic warfare, but as an increasingly normalized one, as a means of sort of, as Professor Adam Tooze once called it, bullying as a mode of power, something in which we are no longer scandalized. Do you see this in Latin America more generally, thinking about Cuba in its region and in its hemisphere, as a tool of diplomacy that is increasingly acceptable or unacceptable? How do you see the consensus, diplomatic consensus around sanctions evolving or co-evolving with its increasing frequency and the increasing evidence that you've presented of its lethality?
Yes, well, that's a great question. As some of you may know, I've devoted a significant part of my intellectual energies over the course of the past few years to studying the impact of sanctions on the Venezuelan economy. And also the question, even though it might appear planned, it's not, but it gives me an opportunity to show you that my book, The Collapse of Venezuela's Scorched Earth Politics and Economic Decline, I just received it. It's actually available. It's going to be available starting on March 15th, so you can pre-order it in Amazon. But part of what I do there is go through the effect, because the Venezuelan case, I mean, sometimes as a scholar specialized in Venezuela, it's sometimes I feel that almost like it's the equivalent of being a rare disease specialist, because Venezuela is sometimes so singular, so different, or perceived as being so different, that it's hard to put it in the same framework that other people use to try to understand growth. But the reality is that this Venezuelan puzzle, this apparent Venezuelan puzzle, is really suggestive of the type of questions that we should be asking in growth, because it is the largest documented peacetime economic collapse in the common era. And you heard that right. I mean, even if you go back to the data produced by Angus Madison to the year zero, there were a lot of bad governments, including Nero and Caligula in that time series. It's still the case that Venezuela's 71% collapse in GDP is the largest one. This is the equivalent of 3 Great Depressions. It's also associated with the largest migration exodus that we've seen in the Western Hemisphere. And therefore, it is very much a source of concern in the region as a whole. And what I argue is that while part of this decline is definitely attributable to policy mistakes, and there's definitely a lot of things that were done wrong by the Venezuelan government's power. In my estimates, around half of that collapse, more precisely 52% in my calculations, are due to sanctions and other measures of economic statecraft taken primarily by the US. So that if we were to strip out the effect of sanctions, what we would have seen in Venezuela would have been a contraction of 31% of GDP, which would have been similar to the type of economic contractions that we've seen associated with policy failures that we've seen in several Latin American countries, for example, that we saw in Peru in the 1990s, and that we've seen even in Venezuela in the 1980s, when you have populist economic policies, and then you have a decline in the terms of trade, which forces macroeconomic adjustment. But in order to really understand why it became such a large collapse, we have to understand the role that sanctions played in it. Now, has this undermined, so how has this affected the consensus or the view of policies in the region? Well, it depends. The region has become very polarized. So you see different sides of this political debate, and what you have seen, of course, is a very deep impact. For example, Colombia is home to 2.8 million Venezuelan immigrants, and this is definitely strained the capacity of the Colombian economy to provide services. At the same time, you have also seen, interestingly, some of the effects that the rest of the literature finds about immigration, that it can be conducive also to growth in GDP and even to growth in productivity, sometimes benefiting from the positive selection effect of those migrants. Although the flip side of this, of course, is that this wave of immigration actually ends up leading some of the higher productivity workers to leave the country, and therefore it deepens the crisis inside the country. But there's definitely quite a lot of concern, and I think that that's what's led to a lot of pushback on U.S. foreign policy from particularly from Venezuela's neighbors, from Colombia and from Brazil, which are seeing, well, if the U.S. returns to this maximum pressure strategy, we're going to be the ones who are paying costs. And when this gets combined with the Trump administration's policy of closing its borders, even if these policies are effective at closing U.S. borders, they're just exacerbating the problem. So this is a lethal combination of going back to maximum pressure on Venezuela and then closing off U.S. borders. What that means is that the pressure is being transferred to other countries in the region, and I think that at some moment that is going to generate a strong political backlash in the region against these policies.
I think that's a perfect segue, Professor, and I want to thank you for continuing this presentation. And of course, we welcome the opportunity to promote this immense work that you are publishing now on the Venezuelan collapse and diving into the sources and consequences of that economic collapse. I think it's a tremendous work, and I'm very happy that our webinar could be an opportunity to show its beautiful cover. But I think it's a perfect segue to our presentation today from another esteemed, distinguished speaker that we welcome onto the webinar, Professor Alfred de Zayas, who has similarly held many posts, but among them, the most destacado perhaps is as you an independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order. Professor, we feel so far away from a democratic and equitable international order, and I think the final graphs from Professor Francisco Rodriguez's presentation will haunt us, I think, through the rest of today's discussion, namely the normalization, the acceleration, and the application of these unilateral coercive measures across. Now, I think the stat is 2/3 of the global population is under some kind of U.S. sanction just from one country. So we want to pass to you now to talk about some of the international legal implications of these sanctions, of the longstanding war on the Cuban people and their revolutionary project, but also to speak a bit about the second and third order consequences for the international order at large, as many of us gathered here, tuning in from all corners of this planet, come together to try to pursue, in the face of its ever sort of collapsing as the pillars of the so-called rules-based international order collapse in front of us, the consequences that these sanctions present to that more global pursuit of a democratic and equitable international order. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor, and the word is yours.
Thank you, David. I hope you hear me well, and my apologies to you and the other listeners, because most likely, since I have a very, shall we say, weak internet here in the chalet, I'm in the mountains in the valley, it may very well happen that it gets interrupted several times. So thank you, Elena Dohan, for your presentation and for your excellent reports to the General Assembly and Human Rights Council. I look forward, by the way, to our forthcoming consultation at the UN in Geneva. Thank you also, Francisco, for your very clear analysis. Obviously, I mean, the international law aspects, the violations of international law by unilateral coercive measures are very patent, and they have been laid out by Dr. Idris Yasairi, who was the first holder of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures. Before that, you had Professor Mark Bosoit, who was a Special Rapporteur of the Subcommission on the protection of minorities. That was back in the year 2000. He presented, shall we say, the landmark study on the adverse impacts of unilateral coercive measures already in the year 2000. Now, today we are witnessing an international disorder characterized by a general assault on international law and the UN Charter. And this attack is not coming from Africans or Asians, but from certain countries of the global north who deploy false narratives and propaganda demanding observance of the rule of law by everybody else except themselves. The assault is coming from the US and Europe, and it manifests itself in many ways, including the threat and the use of force and the imposition of unilateral coercive measures. We discussed this before the Security Council on the 25th of March, 2024. Elena Dohan presented a very thorough report to them, and the statements made by the European and US delegates at the Security Council were so wrong on the law that a first-year law student would have no difficulty discarding them as worthless political pamphlets. We are confronted by Himalayan hubris and double standards. The typical explanation of vote at the General Assembly is this, and I quote, because I mean, I read them, the explanation of votes are always pitiful. The EU imposes and implements its restrictive measures in full conformity with its obligations under international law and the UN Charter. EU restrictive measures are a response to serious violations of international law, including serious violations of human rights. They serve to uphold an international rules-based order, which is in the interests of the entire UN membership. I mean, I don't know whether it's worth even commenting on that. I mean, this statement reeks of moral bankruptcy. We observe want to use the word implemented by UN Special Rapporteur target domestic and foreign rivals. We call this lawfare. The US, EU, and Israel are destroying international order by disregarding ICJ judgments, ICJ advisory opinions, and ICC arrest warrants. German CDU chief Friedrich Merz has invited Netanyahu to Germany and specifically said that Germany will not honor the ICC arrest warrant. So this is open rebellion. We observe the destruction of language. As Noam Chomsky famously wrote once, there are these international lawyers and academics that tamper with words so that they no longer mean what they were intended to mean. I can send you the links to some of the statements of Chomsky on this very issue. It is like the exchange, some of you will remember Alice in Wonderland and Humpty Dumpty. There's an exchange in which Humpty Dumpty claims that he controls language. So he can assign any meaning to any word as he wants. And Alice says, well, you can't do that. And of course I can. It's a question of power. Now, this is what Germans call Deutungshoheit. And it's a lot of debate in Germany on this Deutungshoheit, which basically is destruction of language. Government lawyers are pens for hire who do not advise their governments how best to comply with international law, but how to invent loopholes, how to circumvent the law. Now, the contradictory use of the concept of human rights to try to justify the imposition of illegal UCMs is a classical example of the corruption of concepts in international law. It is almost blasphemy. It is sacrilege to invoke human rights in order to destroy human rights, to invoke human rights to justify unilateral coercive measures that are going to kill people. That's something that has to be perceived. And it is so obvious that sanctions kill. By the way, I never use the word sanctions because the word sanction is a rigged word, the same as the concept of overcompliance. When you say sanctions, you assume that the country or the state that imposes the sanctions has some legal or moral legitimacy, which is not the case. And when you use the term overcompliance, you imply that maybe there is a certain obligation to submit to these unilateral coercive measures. There's a certain obligation to go along with them instead of saying reject the whole business. And this is part of the public relations and propaganda campaign that corrupts language. Now, another argument that is used to justify sanctions is terrorism. Now, you know that the label of terrorism was imposed on some of the greatest heroes of the 20th century, including Nelson Mandela. And a lot of countries went along with it, and a lot of countries were perfectly happy to see Nelson Mandela on the US list, terrorist list, for decades. And now the US, or rather Mr. Trump, has listed Cuba as one of those countries that endorse or support or finance terrorism. Well, I don't think there's any country that finances more terrorism than my country, than the United States of America. I don't think that there's any country that finances or practices state terrorism more than the state of Israel. Now, the problem of UN resolutions without implementation is something that I have written about in my books, The Human Rights Industry and Building a Just World Order. ICJ judgments and advisory opinions without any kind of enforcement. These are facts without consequences, books without follow-up, like the excellent books by Jeffrey Sachs, The Price of Civilization, or An End to Poverty. Well, all of the arguments are there. The problem is that we do not have an effective implementary mechanism. Now, the United States has been urged to lift unilateral coercive measures against Cuba, not once, but 32 times. And people remember that in 2016, the vote was universal. You had 191 votes in favor. and 2 abstentions. The abstentions were, of course, the usual suspects, the United States and Israel, but interestingly enough, they did not vote against it. So you had the entire world saying, lift these illegal unilateral coercive measures. And of course, the United States did not do so, but actually aggravated them. Although the rules on unilateral coercion measures are sufficiently clear, I've been arguing since I was rapporteur. I've argued before the General Assembly and before the Human Rights Council that we need an advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice that should make the legal analysis clear and the erga omnes obligation of the international community not to comply, not to observe, not thus if this year, or rather last November, 187 states endorsed the resolution on the U.S. embargo against Cuba, they should invoke Article 96 of the UN Charter and elevate the legal questions to the ICJ. The advisory opinion should address, among others, and I'm going to read them out. First of all, that UCMs are not sanctions, but they constitute the use of force within the meaning of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. The only legal sanctions being, of course, the sanctions imposed by the Security Council under Chapter 7. The interference in internal affairs of states prohibited in general international law, in customary international law, in GA Resolutions 2625, in the OAS Charter, Articles 19 and 20, quite specific. Then we want to have a clear statement that UCMs are incompatible with customary international law. Issue of extraterritoriality, that should be clarified by the International Court of Justice. It's not just lawyers and professors who write about it. You need the authority of the ICJ behind it. International treaties violate advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the wall being built on Palestine territory back on the 9th of July 2004. That was a school book example of what an advisory opinion is supposed to be. I mean, listed all treaties, the covenants on civil and political rights, racial discrimination, etc., etc. That's what I would like to see with regard to UCMs. Beyond that, the prohibition of, which we know from international, we know the excellent study by Jeff Sachs and Mark, collective punishment applied against Venezuela. That was the report of 2019 that had estimated that for that year, 2018, 40,000 Venezuelans lost their lives as a direct U.S. unilateral coercive measures. Now, the artificial creation of humanitarian crisis through the UCMs, including famine, death through lack of medicine and medical equipment, the equation UCMs, mass migration, refugee movements, that international opinion, and I already wrote it in my report 2018, UCMs are crimes against humanity within the meaning of Article 7 of the Rome Statute. But if I say that, or Alena Dohan says that, or Jeff Sachs says that, that's very interesting. But if the International Court of Justice makes a clear ruling on that, then we can proceed with cases in the International Criminal Court under Article 7 of the Rome Statute. As you all know, Jorge Arriaza, the foreign minister of Venezuela, presented such a case to the International Criminal Court back in February 2020. He personally delivered it to Fatou Bensouda, the then chief prosecutor. And of course, the case has not advanced. And it would be important to have among those 187 states that voted to lift the embargo against Cuba, I would like to see 50 of them join Venezuela in the Venezuela 2 case and demand that that be put on the agenda before the judges at the ICC and that there be a decision on it. UCMs must be understood as not constituting retortion or countermeasures. They are not allowed under Articles 49 and 50 of the ILC's draft code on state responsibility. The principle of proportionality must be also dealt with in such an advisory opinion. UCMs as a form of state terrorism, because UCMs cause indiscriminate harm. The types of adverse human rights impacts of UCMs. As I said, I already referred to Jeff Sachs and Mike Weisbrot's study, Collective Punishment, and there are multiple adverse human rights impacts, whether it be to the right to food, right to health, right to clean water and sanitation, right to education, et cetera, et cetera. Another major problem, complicity in UCMs. As you probably know, Dawn just proposed to the ICC a case on the complicity of Joe Biden and Anthony Blinken, et cetera, on the genocide in Gaza. I'd like to see a case before the ICJ and before the ICC concerning the complicity of all states that connive with or participate in the implementation of UCMs. Now, legal consequences of imposing or implementing UCMs, civil and criminal liability. People think in terms, oh yeah, you would pay compensation for it. Well, of course, a couple of $1 trillion damage to Venezuela or to Cuba. Well, that can be arranged with a monetary payment. No, it cannot, because people have died. People have died in the tens of thousands. So here you have penal liability. Now, the level of compensation due to the victims of UCMs, of course, must also be determined. I pass on to other issues because the time is running away. The states affected by UCMs should join forces and bring contentious cases before international tribunals, including the dispute tribunals of the World Trade Organization. Affected states should craft countermeasures. Here again, those would be genuine countermeasures. A state that has suffered under illegal UCMs has the right of retortion, has the right to adopt countermeasures. Of course, one little state adopting countermeasures against the United States will laugh at them. But if you have 50 states presenting, jointly adopting countermeasures against the United States and against European states that impose sanctions, that will make a difference. I also consider that states are in defending their corporations and businesses when their businesses lose money because of illegal UCMs. You have the instrument of diplomatic And you would expect its enterprises, whereas Switzerland has become complicit in the death of people in Cuba and people in Venezuela, etc., especially during the COVID pandemic, when monies were supposed to be transferred by the UBS to Cuba, and that was blocked. And I would say, according to the long jurisprudence that we know on duty of rescue, that
I'm afraid the chalet is
you cannot just
killing
watch
us now.
someone drown of assistance. Now, when causing tens of thousands of deaths, duty of protection. Yes. How's that? I'm going beyond my time.
No, we lost
I'm
you for
almost
a minute
there.
due to the internet connection. That was all, Professor.
Can you hear me?
Very, very little. It might be time for us to wrap the intervention due to the connectivity issues. But we've heard you almost all the way through.
Well, I think you got a mouthful anyhow. As I say, I am dying to listen to Jeff Sachs, who comes after me. So, as far as I'm concerned, I've given you some ideas, and I hope that we maintain this dialogue among ourselves and among all the other speakers. As I say, I was very impressed by Professor Francisco Rodriguez. I enjoyed that very much, and I hope that we get this
We will.
in some written form.
Certainly. Certainly we will, Professor.
Other than in answering any questions.
Thank you. Thank you. And I take upon myself not only the unfortunate task of cutting short and intervening on behalf of the Chalet's Connection, but also the commitment to sustain the dialogue, not just between the speakers, but also to ensure that the basic presentations, the facts, the data presented here are well disseminated through this network of allies, supporters, and people who want to take seriously what I think is the main argument of your presentation, which is what these unilateral coercive measures amount to as a form of terrorism. I think this brings us again to the haunting slide put forward by Professor Rodriguez about the increasing use of unilateral coercive measures, and brings us to an assessment of what we might call the Trump 2.0 doctrine, which may call itself anti-war in the sense of refusing to put certain boots on the ground, but is not anti-use of force as a mode of bullying, guiding, directing, and otherwise prescribing a political economic project to neighbors near and far. I think Professor Desai,
By the way,
yes.
Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter speaks about the threat or the use of force. In Article 2, Paragraph 4, there's no mention of military force or military attack. It is purposely kept very general. And it's quite clear that in the hybrid warfare world that we live in, that unilateral coercive measures qualify as the use of force. And the use of force, like sanctions of the Security Council, can only be imposed by the United Nations. And a country like the United States or France or Germany that imposes unilateral coercive measures is using force. That must be understood, and that should be clarified by the International Court of Justice an advisory opinion. And as I said, I'm optimistic that you could invoke Article 96 of the UN Charter at the General Assembly, and you would get more than necessary votes to elevate this to the ICJ. And then the ICJ, in its wisdom, applying Article 65 of the statute of the ICJ, could take the case or decide not to take it because it's a hot potato. But the ICJ has taken potatoes that are not even hotter than that one. So I would be optimistic that if the General Assembly, if some states of the non-aligned movement decide to present legal questions like I formulated to the ICJ for an advisory opinion, they will get their resolution adopted, and then it will be in the hands of the ICJ to decide not to take the case. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor. And I think that this speaks to the double mandate, I should say, of this discussion, of this seminar that's being transmitted across the world. On the one hand, it's to understand what is this embargo, what is this blockade, what is this barrage of unilateral coercive measures arrayed against Cuba and its people. And the other is to think about potential remedies, the what is to be done in the face of these criminal measures. And I think you've offered a really sort of, I feel, hugely buoyed by the menu of options that are available to us at the international level in terms of the legal system. The task that we have now, turning to our final distinguished guest, Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University, is to think additionally to these diplomatic and legal measures about potential alternative economic avenues for strengthening Cuba's economic relations through its regional bloc, through its connections to emergent multilateral organizations such as BRICS, as well as to other continental economic cooperation mechanisms, whether it's the European Union, and we can talk about the relationship that Spain has managed to sustain with Cuba as being one of the providers of its only financial avenue for corresponding financially, or indeed with Africa, from which I am tuning in to you now. So without further ado, I would pass the microphone to our final speaker today, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, with whom I've had the pleasure of spending time on the island, and with whom I've had the challenging task of thinking through this second question that comes to us in this discussion of what is to be done in order to not rescue, but to support the Cuban economy and in turn the Cuban people in the face of this unprecedented set of unilateral coercive measures that they have suffered for so many decades. Over to you, Professor Sachs. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm in an incredibly busy schedule.
Thanks to all of you. Wonderful presentations. Thank you for a very deep analysis. Thank you to the Deputy Foreign Minister for such a lucid account of 65 years, my God, of this approach of the United States, which is both cruel and unusual. Unusual in its duration, unusual in its nastiness, unusual in its self-defeating approach. So the question is what to do, and this is surely a bit unclear. I think that there is, although it seems a little paradoxical, perhaps, but I think that if we think a few years out, the situation is likely to improve in general regarding the use of unilateral sanctions. And the reason is that the so-called unipolar moment of the United States is over. The idea that the U.S. runs the show was always absurd and delusional, but it's even now understood in Washington that it was delusional. It's certainly understood in the rest of the world, maybe with the exception of a few extremely misguided people in Europe, that it's delusional. We're really entering a new world in which China, India, Russia, Africa, Latin America will play a much more independent role, and where the United States will play a less dominant role. Ironically, as we enter that multipolar world, the saber rattling by the Trump administration is increasing, not decreasing. But this is a kind of last gasp. It's now more localized imperialism. It aims at Canada, it aims at Mexico, it aims at Panama, it aims at Greenland. No doubt it will aim at Cuba in some way, but it's not actually global scale because the US is, in fact, whether US leaders like it or not, coming to understand they cannot even impose the kind of sanctions that they thought they once could. Remember, just 3 years ago, the sanctions on Russia were predicted by the US to bring Russia to its knees. It did nothing of the sort. And this by itself shows that the US reach of these unilateral sanctions is limited. It's declining in power. There are alternative ways to trade, to conduct settlements in international transactions, to use non-dollar payments arrangements, to find alternative partners, such as the BRICS countries that David mentioned. So while it's no solace for the very short term, I don't believe that we're in an environment in which this sharp rise of US sanctions is likely either to continue or to be effective. In the short term, of course, Donald Trump believes in these instruments, and he certainly believes in tariffs, so he will alienate the entire world. There are no differences between friend and foe when it comes to tariffs for President Trump. He's going to put them on everyone. And this will isolate the United States more. It won't actually do all that much regarding international trade because the vast preponderance of international trade does not involve the United States. It involves other countries, and that will continue whether the United States isolates itself or not. So there are many uncertainties about practically what to do right now, but I'm going to raise one that seems the least likely of all, but I'm going to raise it because I think it's less unlikely than it may seem. And that is that the Trump administration decides to lift some of these sanctions against Cuba. Why do I say so? Because one thing that Trump likes is making money and doing business. And these sanctions actually are absurd from America's point of view. They're extremely damaging from Cuba's point of view, but they're completely absurd from the point of view of American businesses. American businesses would have an extremely active and profitable trade with Cuba. I was looking at the trade that the United States has with Dominican Republic, which is next door and the same size population, 11 million people. And the U.S. does a rip-roaring business of many billions of dollars of exports to the Dominican Republic. And it does what Trump loves. The U.S. runs a trade surplus with the Dominican Republic. It sells a lot more to the Dominican Republic than it buys from the Dominican Republic. I'd like someone in the Trump White House to actually look at the data and understand they're just stupid if they continue this regime, because it's just a loss of businesses across the board, whether it's golf courses and luxury hotels or cruise ships. or other kinds of development, actually, after 65 years, there are enough opportunities that would be hugely beneficial for the United States as well as Cuba to be back in a mutually respectful, law-based economic environment. So I don't want to rule that out. I would like to start with a very transactional approach, as is the famous approach of the White House, and say, you could do business. You're missing big opportunities. And I think that it's not impossible that there's a response that would be surprising. I don't want to go too far on that limb, but within 2 weeks, Russia and the United States became best friends. So everything is possible in this world. One shouldn't assume that what is a nonsensical approach for the United States has to remain in place. It has been 65 years. It's tragic, stupid, boring, but it may actually change. So this is a first point that I would like to emphasize, that we should try to make the case that this is self-defeating from the United States. Not only that it's illegal, that it's cruel, that it's damaging, but that it's a loss of business. At least in this current US administration, that's the only argument that could conceivably work with this administration. This administration's interest in international law is not even an epsilon, it's a zero. So nothing from international law is going to convince the Trump administration to lift US unilateral sanctions or to do anything else in the next few years, by the way. The question is self-interest of the United States. The good thing about economic relations and trade is that they are mutually beneficial. That means that when you close down trade, there's a mutual loss. And so this is a first point that I would like to try to bring to the attention of the U.S. Politicians. Of course, many know it. There are many businesses inside the U.S. that want to do business in Cuba. Cuba wants to do business with the United States. There's on both sides very practical people that would like to do something different. The idea that we're still reacting to events in 1960, and as misguided as that reaction was 65 years ago, but that's driving the U.S. approach today is really mind-boggling in its foolishness. So that's the first point I would like to say. Second, slightly contradictory, there's no doubt that given the administration, don't rely on any one approach. Try many things. A second approach has to be strengthening trade with other partners. So it's quite possible that the U.S. sanctions continue or even are tightened, but that does not by itself really blockade Cuba in the 2020s in the way that it might have 50 years ago. U.S. sanctions, the secondary sanctions, the punishment for third countries, that is coming unstuck in many sanctions regimes around the world, whether it's Iran, Russia, or others, because most other countries don't want to follow the United States, don't respect the U.S. actions, don't want to succumb unilaterally to the U.S. actions. So I believe that there needs to be an outreach to other partners. One is the rest of Latin America, of course, CELAC. CELAC is an extremely weak organization right now, but it is an organization that includes all of the Latin American and Caribbean countries. And its current presidency is Honduras. The next presidency is Colombia. And it's extremely important in the face of Trump's threats to Mexico, to Panama, and no doubt there will be threats to other countries in the region, just on pure security grounds, that CELAC start to function actually as a place where some diplomacy and some actions can be done. But I would say that trade within Latin America is also underperforming, and a lot more could be done. Trade between Mexico and Cuba, trade, of course, all through the Americas on a multilateral basis. The third is the BRICS, which David mentioned. The BRICS are now nearly half the world population. If you take the original BRICS 5, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and now the new BRICS members, which include Egypt, which include Iran, the Emirates, which include Indonesia, and there's a long list of other BRICS countries on the way. And the world output of the BRICS and the trade, which I didn't make the calculation, but the output share is about 40% of GDP. It's a hugely significant group. Many of the countries in the BRICS are under US sanctions. And so the BRICS are spending a tremendous amount of time now, very intently, designing non-dollar payments systems for normal trade among themselves that are impervious to the US sanctions. On the one side, this is not very hard. There's no reason why Russia and China should settle in dollars. This is the most basic point. There's no reason why Iran and Egypt should settle in dollars. So at a technical level, non-dollar settlements is rather straightforward technically. And once you have non-dollar settlements, then the enforceability of US extraterritorial sanctions drops away because countries just go about their business. The US can't legally enforce anything it's doing because everything the US is doing is illegal to begin with. So it's not in any way globally enforceable. The technical problem with non-dollar settlements is that it cannot be done through banks or other financial institutions that also deal in dollars, because even if the specific transaction is a non-dollar settlement, if the institution handling that transaction goes through the SWIFT payment system, it is vulnerable to US unilateral illegal actions. And so creating a non-dollar payment system is tantamount to creating a set of banking institutions that do not also engage in dollars. It's a parallel system. By the way, Donald Trump said a couple of weeks ago that BRICS are dead because he threatened them. And if they do this, he's going to destroy them. So the BRICS are dead. Let's not tell him the secret, okay? He can think that, but the BRICS are going to go ahead. They're going to have non-dollar payments. They are going to go about their business, whether the US huffs and puffs or doesn't huff and puff, because doing this is just not so hard, but it is very important. So this comes to a very practical issue, but it doesn't solve Cuba's problems. I don't want to suggest that, but it comes to a practical point that Cuba has been so profoundly squeezed on the financial side as well as the trade side because of the role of the dollar in international settlements. But there will emerge, I think it's already happening, but within 2 or 3 years, a full apparatus for Cuba at least to trade with the BRICS countries in ways that absolutely will not be subject to threats at a financial level by the United States. Of course, the United States can threaten in more vulgar ways, there's no doubt, but those come with very high costs also for the US. And so, while I don't want to rule out any strange, horrible behavior, I do think that Cuba is going to have greater options for trade with a lot of the world. And I would say engaging closely with the BRICS, joining the BRICS would make sense for Cuba. It makes sense for probably the 25 or 30 countries that are in line to do this. And those countries are in line to do it because they actually don't want to be ruled by US unilateral sanctions or the dollar payment system. Finally, let me say that the idea of an ICJ advisory opinion, not on Cuba per se, but on the raft of unilateral sanctions, I think is an excellent idea. And I think that it should go forward. The UN General Assembly can, and we have with Alfred, the world's expert on all of this, but the UN General Assembly can ask for an advisory opinion of the ICJ. The rise of unilateral economic coercive measures in the last decade in particular is so abusive and stark that it does seem to me that the ICJ needs to be now formally requested by the UN General Assembly to give an advisory opinion about the legality of these actions. Of course, the US will not accept an ICJ ruling, but many countries in Europe which have blindly followed the US in the sanctions probably still have a shred of decency in them. Though sometimes one wonders about Europe these days, but I think Europe is still better than the United States in its international law abidingness. And so when the ICJ rules that these sanctions are illegal under the UN Charter, it will make a difference. So I hope Alfred could represent the UN General Assembly in presenting the issues to the ICJ. But it seems to me that that's a complementary measure that should be done, not necessarily with Cuba in the lead, but with the dozens and dozens of countries that are subject to unilateral coercive measures, jointly taking this on through the UN General Assembly request under the Charter to the ICJ. So none of this promises any assured relief from 65 years of abuse. By the way, Francisco does the best work on the effects of all of this. But one easy way, I think, to look at this, which I was looking at just a few minutes ago, if you look at Cuba's economy relative to other countries in the Caribbean nearby, like the Dominican Republic, Cuba was 4 or 5 times richer than the Dominican Republic in the early 1950s. Now it's poorer than the Dominican Republic. This has been a hugely costly period without question. Whether it is relieved or not, I think we should help Cuba and other countries that are under these illegal sanctions to find every possible means through shifts of trade, through trying to convince a absolutely benighted US government about lost business opportunities through the BRICS, through regional cooperation, and through the ICJ to finally get this chapter of economic warfare finished. So just a few brief thoughts. Unfortunately, no decisive breakthrough, but I think that there are things that can be done.
So, Jeff, just a couple questions before we wrap in response to this presentation. I think we were supposed to be in dialogue, so I'm going to challenge you on some of the underlying assumptions, maybe.
Sure.
Or rather, I would say I'm clinging to your optimism, because I think what we can see, we're having this webinar on the 27th of February. It's been almost, it's been a month since Trump returned to the White House, and the scale, the scope, the ambition, and the speed of this new administration dwarfs Trump 1.0. I mean, there seems to be more alacrity and less shame about their willingness to take on the world, even as you might say, the weapon or the fear instilled by U.S. threats and saber rattling is less than it was. My concern is about thinking about the effect of Trump's kaleidoscopic approach to sustaining U.S. hegemony and its effectiveness. I think what we can see now, and I say this now speaking in my capacity as co-general coordinator of this organization, the Progressive International, where I have a chance to work with governments from across the world, but with a focus on the global South, we can see is a certain bilateralization of diplomacy, a narrow focus, a tunnel vision that has come to a lot of countries in Latin America, certainly. But I'm in Senegal now. I think it's true for a lot of countries in Africa as well. Certainly it's true of the South African case, where the U.S. has taken a particular sick, twisted interest in defense of the so-called Afrikaner population from its race-based discrimination. Is that tunnel vision means sort of a defensive crouch that looks at the U.S. and tries to renegotiate or negotiate or take on the issues related to its global position through the prism of its relationship to the Trump administration. And what that means, and I think I can cite fairly clearly, and I'm sure Professor Rodriguez would agree with me, the recent cancellation of the emergency CELAC meeting that was supposed to take place in Honduras last month, which was supposed to be an emergency response to the escalating rhetoric and threats issued from Washington to Bogota about the treatment of migrants and about the tariffs attending to those treatment or caught up in that renegotiation of migrant relations. And so I guess my question back to you is, should we hope and hang our hopes on the idea that as Trump 2.0 sort of as this rhythm, this really almost psychotic and certainly highly distracting rhythm of policymaking and executive order issuing, which is unprecedented in our great republic, as that begins to settle down, should we then expect regionalism to be reborn and to see more of these initiatives, right? Should we expect that tunnel vision will eventually broaden out and more ambitious proposals, which have since been tabled around alternative currencies or parallel payment systems, for those to come back onto the table as something that feels not just viable, but necessary for many countries in the global South on the other side of these unilateral coercive measures? Or should we be trying to force the issue? Should we be going and, be more academics or activists in general and trying to force the issue? I mean, the question is sort of, do you think it's reasonable for us to kind of take our time, be patient, and expect these tectonic shifts in the international order to take effect and rearrange and open new political opportunities in that structure of international relations? Or do you think a country like Cuba and its allies should be more creative, more aggressive, more offensive in finding ways for third countries, for example, to trade with Cuba? Because the bilateralization, my concern there, is a country like Mexico, so caught up as it is in managing questions of migration, security, of trade relations, for them to open a new front of their dialogue, we might say, with Washington based on their frank desire, reiterated time and again, to provide food and medicine and fuel to an ailing Cuba and a Cuban economy, right? They may feel that that's one front too many in the present context. So how can we shore up the confidence to stand with Cuba and perhaps to pursue jointly a kind of mechanism of to respond to unilateral coercive measures as acts of terrorism as they are, as Professor said in his earlier presentation? Or should we try to sort of lean into this tectonic shift and draw some confidence that the political opportunity structure is already changing in such a way that we should be leaning into those new avenues as opposed to trying to force the issue at a time of really heightened tensions between the United States and certainly its hemispheric allies and adversaries alike?
Yeah, I think the basic principle is that stronger regional integration in Latin America, that means CELAC. In Africa, it means the African Union. In Southeast Asia, ASEAN. In the Arab region, the Arab League, are more important than ever. The United States will try to pick apart any country on a bilateral basis. And you know, like a bully, it will bully any individual country. It's much harder to bully a region that is sticking together against the bullying. And there is lots of bullying going on all over the world. In the Middle East, of course, the grave threat right now is ethnic cleansing and continued genocide in Gaza. And the unity of the Arab League is extraordinarily important right now. It's vital. It's vital for the survival of the Palestinians, and it's vital for the Arab nations. What Trump is doing is one by one trying to threaten Egypt or threaten Jordan or entice the Saudis and so forth. And so that's just a different kind of example where the regional cooperation is essential. You can't really bargain bilaterally with Trump very easily. Maybe he can come to understand that there's a bargain that's useful from his very narrow perspective, which is win for me, lose for you. And that's possible. But the idea that we'll try to negotiate and meet him halfway, for example, Zelensky signing this absurd minerals document in the White House tomorrow. This is, of course, that's a very particular issue, but this kind of bilateral negotiation is doomed to fail. I don't mean that Cuba should make compromises because they're going to compromise with the U.S. in bargaining. When I spoke about helping the United States to understand it's just losing from this really not only nasty policy, but foolish policy, self-defeating policy, that's a different kind of discussion. It's not a bargaining to reach a midpoint. It's rather helping the United States to understand that this great ideological crusade that it started 65 years ago is just dumb. It's decades out of date. Put aside all the other issues, it just is losing money. That's something that Trump could understand, and I think it's an approach that should actually be made, and other politicians could understand it. So, you know, I'm not against, by far, creativity, finding alternatives, but I do believe that we should take note of the fundamental point that Trump is not a global hegemonist, by the way. There's no doubt that he's not a global hegemonist. He's basically said to Russia, look, we're getting out of there. This is not our business. It's far away. We've got a big ocean in between. Biden was a global hegemonist. Biden was much, much worse in that regard. Trump is you know, he'll mug you, that's for sure, but he's not a global hegemonist in the way that the Democrats were, in the way that Biden was. So in this sense, there's something different to deal with. And my advice is, I know CELAC's almost nothing right now, but it should be something. It really should be something, and it would really become something, actually. Of course, it doesn't have the constitutional makeup, it's unanimity and so forth, but it actually should make a structure pretty quickly because the interests the common interests of the Latin American countries and the Caribbean are actually quite strong. And Mexico is in a position to play a strong role in that in a way that the United States cannot stop. And by the way, the US announced this morning, okay, it's putting on tariffs on Mexico. It's not worth negotiating. This is just stupid self-harm by the United States as well as harm to Mexico. And I don't know whether there will be grown-ups that will understand how destructive it is. The American people will find out that this is not going to give them jobs. It's not going to give them well-being. It's not going to solve any single problem that Trump was actually voted on to solve. It's not even going to help the oligarchs that are around him. None of this helps anybody. It's kind of a mindless foreign policy. But it does mean, in my view, that yes, Mexico should stand up and say, we're helping to organize this regional group to be something more meaningful. I would do that right now. I wouldn't delay that. I would say that we need a CELAC. Well, CELAC has its annual meeting with China. Good. CELAC has its annual meeting, should have its annual meeting with the BRICS. Good. Go for it. Remember, a lot of what's happening right now is rhetorical. It's bluster. Inside the US, the situation's not very good. The budget deficits are huge. They're about to give tax cuts to some super billionaires and deprive Medicaid of tens of millions of poor Americans. They're going to do that. It's incredible. It's not going to be popular. It's going to be a mess in the United States very soon. And so the rest of the world's going to have to go on to do its business. I would try to find opportunities along the way wherever we can find them. I believe while the UN is almost at low ebb right now, really basically broken, maybe the Security Council actually voted a resolution last week because the US, China, and Russia sided with each other. Maybe, you never know how weird things could be to start turning something around. But I'm a big fan of the BRICS. I'm a big fan of regional groupings. I'm a big fan of multipolarity. And I'm a big fan of realism, which is that the United States doesn't call the shots. We shouldn't exaggerate the power or the influence. We shouldn't doubt the short-sightedness, that's for sure. But we shouldn't overdo it in terms of panic, because actually the world is moving forward in proper ways, and the United States is going to have to cut its military budget, is going to have to cut back, is going to stop some of these wars, not necessarily on time as we would like, but we shouldn't panic. That's the point.
And I think by way of conclusion, we shouldn't panic, and we shouldn't overstate the stasis of this international system and the opportunities afforded by its transformation. And we shouldn't understate the role and protagonism that Cuba and Cubans have had and will have in that transformation.
Absolutely.
This small and mighty island that, not only led a revolution that set an example for the world 6.5 decades ago, but since then has participated in the construction of the non-aligned movement, of the articulation of the new international economic order that has led, through Fidel's vision, the global movement to reconsider structures of sovereign debt that not only afflicted Cuba and Cubans, but so many countries across the then third world. And of course, their vision for what a new medical internationalism or economic cooperation would look like in the 21st century. So I'm not just confident I don't just hang my confidence on your general assessment, Professor Sachs, of a changing world, but indeed on Cuba's ability to act as a force factor in helping to guide us towards a more democratic and equitable international order, as Professor Desayas has been fighting for a long time. And I think it's on that note that I want to thank you all, really insist that the energies collected, collated, and generated in this Zoomed webinar, I think, are hopefully continue to generate a collaboration, I think, between the scholars and practitioners and diplomats who came and participated today, as well as our viewers from across the world. I'm really kind of enthused and inspired by many of the very practical strategies tabled here. And of course, Professor Sachs's words, I think I'll try to just cling on to that when I wake up in the morning. As I suffer a bit from the pessimism of intellect, even though there's optimism of will. So I think if I can cling to the idea that we might be moving into a world rife with opportunities for democratic and equitable restructuring of the international order, that's something I think we can all get behind. For now, I want to thank Deputy Foreign Minister Carlos Cosillo. I want to thank, of course, the UN Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Course of Sanctions, Alina Duan. I want to thank our esteemed additional speakers, Professor Francisco Rodriguez in Denver, whose new book should be bought and should be read by all to make sense of what are sanctions and how do they participate in the unprecedented destruction of an economy in Venezuela in particular. I want to thank Alfred de Salles for his wise words, which I hope many people who work in the multilateral system are listening. We need more lawyers. No one ever says this, but we need more lawyers on our side and not their side. So hopefully we can take up some of these strategies and see you in The Hague. And of course, I want to thank Professor Jeffrey Sachs out of Columbia University and the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment more generally for cooperating and supporting us to put together this incredible webinar today. I think the road is long, but it's incredible to have such robust and brilliant allies to help us right a 65-year-old wrong and see about how the rippling consequences of righting that wrong will have for the international order at large. So thank you all so much. Thank you all for listening, for viewing, and I hope to see you all in real life very soon.